Okay, picture this. You know that very specific, heavy ache in your chest? You're sitting in a meeting, just listening to your manager speak with absolute, unshakable confidence about a project they completely misunderstand. Your brain is instantly mapping out every single flaw. You've got the facts ready, you've prepped the perfect argument, and you are totally geared up to be the smartest person in the room so you can save everyone time and money. Sound familiar? Well, welcome to today's Explainer, where we're breaking down some truly fascinating and honestly pretty ruthless concepts on how to survive toxic authority, drawing a lot of inspiration from the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. It really makes you wonder, right? If you are so capable, why do you always lose arguments you absolutely should win? The analysis we're diving into today points out a pretty harsh reality. Gathering facts to combat high-status stupidity just doesn't work. It literally only drains you. In fact, trying to use your intelligence as a shield in the modern corporate asylum is basically committing what the source material calls intellectual suicide.
And that brings us to the intelligence trap. It's this fatal delusion we hold on to, thinking that the people in charge actually value truth over dominance. If you've ever felt like your brilliance is actively being punished, the sources we're looking at today validate that 100%. Because to an insecure, toxic manager, your intellect isn't a company asset, it's a mirror. It reflects their own inadequacy right back at them. And when a fool with power sees that reflection, yeah, they will do absolutely everything they can to shatter the mirror.
So let's move into Section 1, Anatomy of the Ignorant Mind, and how ignorance acts as an active defense mechanism.
To actually survive this kind of environment, we really need to understand why logic just completely fails. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer gives us this incredibly visceral metaphor. He says that when you try to offer data or nuance to a toxic manager, you are essentially speaking mathematics to a barking dog. Because the thing is, the toxic manager isn't driven by a quest for optimal company performance at all. They're driven by deep, unacknowledged insecurity. And ironically, they absolutely thrive on the friction that your frustration provides.
This honestly brilliantly illustrates why logic fails so hard against the Dunning-Kruger effect. Think about Daniel Kahneman's famous psychological framework. You are out here wasting immense caloric energy on System 2 logic, careful mathematical reasoning, against someone who is operating entirely on emotional, instinct-driven System 1 impulses. They aren't processing your spreadsheet. They're just processing whether or not you are submitting to their dominance.
So, how much friction should you actually give them? Zero. Literally zero. That is the exact amount of friction you should offer a toxic manager. Because the very second you push back, the moment you give them your anger or even your well-reasoned frustration, you're proving to them that their absurd ideas are actually worthy of your time.
All right, let's shift to Section 2, the playbook of the ancients and its hidden architecture.
Instead of going in with this naive optimism, we can look at the tactics used by history's greatest minds to manage the ignorant. This brings us to a historical concept known as the submission gambit. The source text highlights the legendary strategist Sima Yi. When he ended up serving a very powerful, deeply envious regent, he didn't try to outsmart him in public. No way. Instead, he faked a total collapse. He completely anesthetized his enemy's ego to lower their defenses entirely, which gave him absolute, unhindered maneuverability in the shadows. The actual historical anecdote behind this strategy is wild. Sima Yi literally pretended to be a pathetic, broken old man who couldn't even stop himself from spilling soup down his own robes. By appearing completely harmless and totally incompetent, he acted as a narcotic to his enemy's insecurity. He fed the fool's ego and made them fall completely asleep at the wheel. Which brings us to Section 3, Savage Tactics for the Office. Now, you probably shouldn't dump soup on yourself in your next performance review, right? But bringing this into the modern boardroom, here is your real arsenal. The goal here is not to win the debate. It's to disarm the fool without ever giving them the gift of the truth. You can employ strategic irony, you can execute a reductio ad absurdum, or you can simply ask them for totally trivial advice just to keep their ego fed and compliant.
Let's compare how a couple of these actually play out. With strategic irony, you tell them their idea is so extraordinary you just have to defer to them. They puff out their chest, and you calmly exit the conversation. Or, let's say you really need to push back. You use reductio ad absurdum. You agree with their absurd premise so violently that you push it to a catastrophic conclusion. You just enthusiastically suggest doubling the scope and ruining everyone's weekend until they literally have to backpedal to save face.
At the end of the day, this crucial point is really all about bandwidth management. Every single hour you spend debating a fool is an hour stolen from your own empire. These people are energy vampires, plain and simple. They don't produce, they just consume.
Interacting with them genuinely degrades your own decision-making abilities, which is exactly why your mental capital has to be fiercely protected.
Moving right along to Section 4, the psychological quarantine and protecting your mind.
Your ultimate tool to survive this contagious stupidity is what's called the social avatar. Because honestly, in a world full of intellectual predators, bringing your authentic self to the office is a massive liability. Instead, you deploy an avatar. It's a polite, smiling mask. You're physically present, sure, but you are entirely intellectually absent. Meanwhile, your true mind remains completely protected behind a fortress of detachment.
And here is exactly what your avatar sounds like. It uses zero-calorie phrases. Things like, that's an interesting perspective, or I see what you mean, or I'll defer to your superior judgment. When confronted with toxic nonsense, you just reflect their own noise back at them like a mirror. You turn what could have been a totally draining argument into a calm, clinical observation of their cognitive biases.
Pulling this off requires a pretty massive shift in identity. You really have to stop being the exhausted intellectual warrior who plays for applause and desperately needs to be recognized as right. Instead, you become the architect. The architect is cold. They're detached. They play strictly for outcomes, and they treat their intellect not as a flashy badge, but as a concealed weapon that they only draw when victory is absolute. There's this incredibly ruthless metaphor in The Explainer that just perfectly solidifies this mindset shift. Stop treating toxic managers as your intellectual equals. You wouldn't ask toddlers for permission to build a house, and you certainly wouldn't explain load-bearing capacities to them. You hand them a cheap toy to distract them, and you pour the concrete for your empire while they're looking the other way. You've got to start treating these people like heavy machinery. The second you finally let go of this desperate need to be understood by people who are literally incapable of understanding, it's like a weight lifts. All that exhaustion vanishes, you move from anger to clarity, you realize you just have to manage their Dunning-Kruger effect, not try to fix it. And then, your intellect is finally freed up to become a tool for your own elevation.
So let's wrap up this explainer with a provocative question you really need to ask yourself about your own ego. Are you going to keep screaming into the hurricane, begging for the applause of lesser minds? Or are you completely ready to step into the uncensored level of the architect? The choice is yours. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep building your empire.